Tom Brokaw, what was your reaction when you were asked to be President Nixon's press secretary?
Startled, I suppose, is the best way of describing it, and hoping that I would be up to it.
What were you doing at the time?
You know, I don't actually remember that very moment what I was doing at the time.
No, I mean, what were you doing professionally at the time? Where were you with NBC?
I was in Los Angeles. I was just kind of beginning my ramping up in my career. I had just signed a new contract. It was a very unsettling moment for me. I actually just recently reunited with a man who took me to lunch and made the offer.
Who was that?
His name is Cliff Miller, and he said they didn't give up. They kept coming back to him, and he said, I looked into his eyes, he's not going to do this. You know, you're always flattered when someone in the White House wants you to serve in an important role. My family were not Nixon people, to put it mildly. But at the same time, I had covered him. I knew that he had extraordinary political skills. He was a very complicated man in so many ways. But the idea of going to work for him never, ever faintly passed across my consciousness. And I was I wouldn't say I was in a state of terror, but I was in some anxiety because this is something I didn't want to get out. I was starting my career as a political reporter. I didn't want people to think I was a Nixon person or a Kennedy person or a Johnson person. So I went back to NBC after the pitch had been made and said, you've got to get me out of this. And Julian Goodman from NBC, who was then the head of the network, was coming down to the White House the next day. And he went to Bob Haldeman quietly and privately. It was Haldeman's idea, and said, you know, we've got big plans for Tom, and he really wants to pursue his career. And it went away. Now, do you want to hear the follow-up? Because there are two of them that are pretty intriguing. No one knew about it. And many years later, after Watergate, after the resignation of the president, I was at Hofstra doing a retrospective on the Nixon years and on Watergate. And I was standing backstage waiting to go on when I was embraced from behind in a big bear hug. And this very familiar voice said to me, do you know how many times I've looked at you on television and thought, I could have sent him to jail? And it was Bob Haldeman. And I said, Bob, never comes up again. And then when I turned 50, they went around with a camera crew to get the reactions of a lot of people. And the camera crew came back to my office wide-eyed and tipped me off to what was going on and said, we've just been with Richard Nixon. He was standing in front of a flag. Look at this. And they played the tape. And it's Nixon saying, I've always thought Tom Brokaw was a man of good judgment. He never showed better judgment than when he turned down my offer to be my press secretary. So the history worked out fine for me. I didn't take the job. I don't think I would have been very good at it because I would have had journalistic instincts. I would have been saying to one of the reporters, I think you got a point there. You know, it's a special kind of job, and I was not equipped for it.
Tom Brokaw writes about that incident in Boom, talking about the 60s, what happened, how it shaped today, lessons for tomorrow. How many presidents have you covered?
Well, I always say that the first campaign I really covered was Lyndon Johnson, but I covered it in the minor leagues out in the Midwest. But in fact, when it comes to presidents, I had several encounters with Dwight Eisenhower, and I'd kind of forgotten about that. He came to Omaha and campaigned for Barry Goldwater, for example, in '64. And then when Ronald Reagan got elected, he went down to see Dwight Eisenhower in the desert, in Palm Desert. And at the time, we knew that Richard Nixon wanted to run again in '68. And Reagan was the new star in the West, and there were some murmurings about him maybe running. So Reagan went down just to spend some time with Dwight Eisenhower, and as the limousine pulled out of the country club where they were, the press scrum surrounded them, and out of the car popped Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower. Reagan, when you look back on it now, you can see how the country gravitated to him, first in California. He was so handsome and so in command of who he was. And then there was Ike, and I had grown up during World War II. He was the biggest hero of my young lifetime. The man who commanded American forces became two-term president of the United States. And for some reason, the Los Angeles press corps was paralyzed in place. So I stepped forward and I began asking questions of what I called General Eisenhower. I didn't call him the president because, to me, he had always been a general. We had a really good exchange in which he said he wanted Reagan to run as a favorite son in '68. He thought that would be good for the party and good for the country. That was, in its own way, a kind of a shot at Richard Nixon.
Boom, you write. 1 minute it was Ike and the man in the gray flannel suit and the lonely crowd. And the next minute it was time to turn on, tune in, drop out, time for We Shall Overcome and Burn Baby Burn. While Americans were walking on the moon, Americans were dying in Vietnam. There were assassinations and riots. Jackie Kennedy became Jackie O. There were tie-dye shirts and hard hats, Black Power and Law and Order, Martin Luther King Jr. and George Wallace, Ronald Reagan and Tom Hayden, Gloria Steinem and Anita Bryant, Mick Jagger and Wayne Newton. Well, you get the idea. Boom.
You know, I don't want to overstate this, but seldom, I think, in our recent history at least, has there been such a fast pan forward to a new reality as we went from the end of the Eisenhower years and the beginning of the Kennedy years, which were traditional, but it was a new generation. It was an entirely different kind of generation. Jack Kennedy didn't wear a hat, and he didn't wear button-down shirts, and he had the very stylish 34-year-old First Lady of the United States surrounded by all these dashing people. And then that came to an end, and the war began to heat up, and suddenly the country seemed to come unhinged in a way. All the values the World War II generation had to come home with were being challenged from within their own families, the institutions of government, the place of government in our lives, the idea of loyalty or patriotism, all that went out the window. The civil rights movement went from a nonviolent movement led by Dr. King, depending on the rule of law. It went to the streets. Violence in America is as American as cherry pie. So it was a head-snapping time. There was no question about it. And the fact that we emerged from it in reasonably good shape is still fairly astonishing to me. It's a real tribute to the tensile strength, I think, of this country in a lot of ways.
I began my marriage, Tom Brokaw writes, and my career as a journalist in 1962, a straight arrow product of the 50s. By the time the decade was over, I'd had my first taste of marijuana. I had long hair, and on weekends I wore bell-bottoms and peasant shirts when, as a family, we went to hippie arts festivals in the hills north of LA. But Meredith and I were raising our children essentially as we had been raised by our Great Depression and World War II parents back in the Midwest.
We then went on to raise our children in New York, and our very close friend Calvin Trillin, Bud Trillin, was raising his children simultaneously in Greenwich Village, and the two families were very close, and Bud always had the line that we adopted. He'd look at his kids from time to time and say, all appearances to the contrary, you're being raised in Kansas City. I think we tried to retain the values with which we had been raised, the manner in which we'd been raised. Our kids would go back to South Dakota and spend time with their grandparents every year. We sent them to camp in Minnesota because we wanted them to have some appreciation of the culture from which they came. You know, it was a heady time. Steve Roberts and Cokie Roberts were very close friends of ours, and they were doing the same thing we were. They were raising their children in traditional fashion. But we've often talked that on weekends you could kind of put on costumes and be, if not part-time hippies, you could skirt around the edge of what appeared to be a kind of liberation movement of some kind. Wasn't true for everyone, obviously. There was the silent majority. There were a lot of people like Ron Ziegler and Haldeman, for example, and Dwight Chapin. They came out of USC, and they were still the straight arrow kind of country club set. So there were lots of cultures in play in California in those days. But on Monday morning, I had to get up and put on a shirt and tie and a jacket and go off to pursue my career as a journalist.
Are there parallels to be drawn from the 60s to today?
I think that there are some parallels. The separation between the values of the parents and many of their children are not nearly as great today as they were then. I have this kind of mythical family that I described. I say, imagine somebody who joined the Marine Corps at the age of 18 in 1941, went off and fought all across the Pacific, came home, married his high school sweetheart, got a good job in Detroit, caught that wave of prosperity that came with the working class families of that time, had a little fishing cabin in the Upper Peninsula. And one day he came home.